What you're about to hear is an excerpt from the book The Evolution of Civilizations by Carol Quigley. No, you're not about to get slipped an audiobook when you ordered a podcast, don't worry, because Nima and I will indeed talk as we normally do right after this introduction. So stick around, because we're going to be shifting gears this episode and getting into one of my favorite topics: the evolution of civilizations. Scientific method and the social sciences. During the summer that I was 12 years old, I walked 4 or 5 times a week to fish from Hingham Bridge. The distance was about 5 miles, part of it along a high railroad embankment that had been ballasted with crushed quartz. In this ballast were hundreds of quartz crystals. Each day I stopped a while to look for a perfect crystal. I found some excellent ones, but never one that could be called perfect. The books I consulted told me that a quartz crystal should be a hexagonal prism with a regular hexagonal pyramid at the end. The ones I found were invariably irregular in some way, with sides of varying sizes, frequently with several crystals jammed together so that, in seeking to share the same material, they mutually distorted each other's hexagonal regularity. After several weeks of casual searching, I found 3 or 4 crystals that were almost perfect, at least at the pyramidal end. But to find these, I had examined and discarded hundreds of distorted crystals. By what right, I asked, did the books say that the quartz crystals occurred in regular pyramidal hexagonal prisms, when only a small percentage of those found had such a shape? Obviously, the books meant that crystallized quartz has a tendency to take hexagonal form, and will do so unless distorted by outside forces. The fact that 99% are distorted does not deter the scientist from forming in his mind an idealized picture of an undistorted crystal, or from stating in books that quartz crystals occur in that idealized form. Later, when I studied science in school and college, I found that most scientific laws were of this idealized character. They were not statements of what actually happens in the world, or of what we observe through our senses, but rather were highly idealized and much oversimplified relationships that might occur if a great many other influences, which were always present, were neglected. I found that the most highly praised scientific laws attributed to the great men like Galileo or Newton were of this character. It was a blow to discover that Newton's laws of planetary motion did not, in fact, describe the movements of the sun's satellites as we observe them, except in a very approximate way. In some cases, notably that of the planet Mercury, the approximation was by no means close. Still later, when my interest shifted from the physical sciences to the social sciences, I worked with students of human society who were generally lacking in any close familiarity with the natural sciences. Still later, when my interests shifted from the physical sciences to the social sciences, and I worked with students of human society who were generally lacking in any close familiarity with the natural sciences, I found a curious situation. The social scientists usually had erroneous ideas about the methods and theories of natural science, believing them to be rigid, exact, and invariable. Accordingly, they felt that these methods were not applicable to the social sciences. Thus I found that natural scientists were quite prepared to accept as a law a rule that was only approximately true, or was true in only one case in 100, while the social scientists were reluctant to accept any rule that was only approximate, or even had no more than one exception in 100 cases. After years of work in both areas of study, I concluded that the social sciences were different, in many important ways, from the natural sciences, but that the same scientific methods were applicable to both areas, and, indeed, that no very useful work could be done in either area except by scientific methods. In both areas, the laws arising from the use of scientific methods will be idealized theories, reflecting observed phenomena only approximately. But these theories must be based on our observations, and any wide failure of approximation or any totally inapplicable cases must either be explained in terms of unconsidered outside factors, or the theories themselves must be changed to cover such variant observations. The laws of historical change described in this book seem to me to fit the observed cases at least as closely as most of the theories of natural science. Most of the laws I shall mention apply, without exception, or with only slight, explicable divergences, to all the cases I know. They are then, it would seem to me, as worthy of consideration as the scientific laws on the formation of crystals. Before proceeding to examine any theories of historical change, we should review what we understand by the term scientific method. In general, this method has three parts which we might call 1. Gathering evidence, 2. Making a hypothesis, and 3. Testing the hypothesis. The first of these, gathering evidence, refers to collecting all the observations relevant to the topic being studied. The important point here is that we must have all the evidence, for obviously, omission of a few observations, or even one vital case, might make a considerable change in our final conclusions. It is equally obvious, I hope, that we cannot judge that we have all the evidence, or cannot know what observations are relevant to our subject, unless we already have some kind of tentative hypothesis or theory about the nature of that subject. In most cases, a worker does have some such preliminary theory. This leads to two warnings. In the first place, the three parts of the scientific methodology listed above were listed in order, not because a scientist performs them separately in sequence, but simply because we must discuss them in an orderly fashion. And, in the second place, any theories, even those regarded as final conclusions at the end of all three parts of scientific method, remain tentative. As scientific methodology is practiced, all three parts are used together at all stages, and therefore no theory, however rigorously tested, is ever final, but remains at all times tentative, subject to new observation and continued testing by such observation. No scientist ever believes that he has the final answer or ultimate truth on anything. Rather, he feels that science advances by a series of successive, and, he hopes, closer, approximations to the truth. And, since the truth is never finally reached, the work of scientists must indefinitely continue. Science, as one writer put it, is like a single light in the darkness. As it grows brighter, it shows more clearly the area of illumination and, simultaneously, lengthens the circle of surrounding darkness. Having gathered all the relevant evidence, the scientist may proceed to the second part of scientific methodology, making a hypothesis. In doing this, two rules must be followed. A. The hypothesis must explain all the observations, and B. The hypothesis must be the simplest one that will explain them. These two rules might be summed up in the statement that a scientific hypothesis must be adequate and it must be simple. Once again, let us confess that these two rules are idealistic rather than practicable, but they remain, nevertheless, the goals by which a scientist guides his activities. Even today, few scientists, and perhaps even fewer non-scientists, realize that science is a method and nothing else. Even in books pretending to be authoritative, we are told that science is a body of knowledge, or that science is a certain area of study. It is neither of these. Science clearly could be a body of knowledge only if we were willing to use the name for something that is constantly changing. From week to week, even from day to day, the body of knowledge to which we attribute the name science is changing, the beliefs of one day being, sooner or later, abandoned for quite different beliefs. Closely related to the erroneous idea that science is a body of knowledge is the equally erroneous idea that scientific theories are true. One example of this belief is the idea that such theories begin as hypotheses and somehow are proved and become laws. There is no way in which any scientific theory could be proved, and as a result, such theories always remain hypotheses. The fact that such theories work and permit us to manipulate and even transform the physical world is no proof that these theories are true. Many theories that were clearly untrue have worked and continue to work for long periods. The belief that the world is a flat surface did not prevent men from moving about on its surface successfully. The acceptance of Aristotelian beliefs about falling bodies did not keep people from dealing with such bodies, and doing so with considerable success. Men could have played baseball on a flat world under Aristotle's laws, and still pitched curves and hit home runs with as much skill as they do today. Eventually, to be sure, erroneous theories will fail to work and their falseness will be revealed, but it may take a very long time for this to happen, especially if men continue to operate in the limited areas in which the erroneous theories were formulated. Thus, scientific theories must be recognized as hypotheses and as subjective human creations no matter how long they remain unrefuted. Failure to recognize this helped to kill the ancient science in the days of the Greeks. Scientific method as we have presented it, consisting of observation, making hypotheses, and testing, is as applicable to the social sciences as it is to the natural sciences. To be sure, certain variations in applying it to the social sciences are necessary. But this is equally true of various parts of the natural sciences. These variations are most needed in testing hypotheses. Even in the natural sciences, we frequently cannot use two of the three kinds of testing. We cannot use controlled experiments in these fields or in astronomy. But these deficiencies do not prevent us from regarding geology or astronomy, seismology or meteorology as sciences. Nor should similar deficiencies, especially difficulty in forecasting and the impossibility of controlled experimentation, prevent us from applying the scientific method to the social sciences. The applicability of scientific method to the study of society has also been questioned on the grounds that theories of social sciences are too changeable. We are told that every generation must rewrite the history of the past, or even that every individual must form his own picture of history. This may be true to some extent, but it is almost equally true of the natural sciences. Science is a method, not a body of knowledge or a picture of the world. The method remains largely unchanged, except for refinements, generation after generation, but the body of scientific knowledge resulting from the use of this method, or the world picture it provides, is changing from month to month and almost from day to day. The scientific picture of the universe today is quite different from that of even so recent a man as Einstein, and immensely different from those of Pasteur and Newton. And even at a given moment, the body of knowledge possessed by any single scientist, or the world picture he has made from that knowledge, is quite different from that possessed by other scientists. Yet such persons are all worthy to be called scientists if they use the scientific method. The same is true in the social sciences. The one major difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences is the assumption, made in the former, that human thoughts cannot influence what happens. This is an assumption justified by the rule of simplicity, although few persons recognize that it is. There is a considerable body of evidence that human thoughts can influence the physical world, but this evidence, segregated into such fields as parapsychology or even the psychic world, is not acceptable to the natural sciences. As a result, phenomena such as poltergeist manifestations, largely because they cannot be repeated on request, go unexplained and are generally ignored by the natural sciences. The latter continue to assume that physical processes are immune to spiritual influences. In the social sciences, on the other hand, it is perfectly clear that human thoughts can influence what happens, and, accordingly, the social scientist must face the more complicated situation created by this admission. Thus we assume that a rock dropped from a high window will fall even if everyone in the world expected it to rise or wanted it to rise. On the other hand, we are quite prepared to see the price of General Motors common stock rise if any large group of people expects it to rise. In a somewhat similar fashion, expectation of a war or desire for a war will make war more likely. This difference between the social sciences and the natural sciences make it possible to draw up fairly definite conditions distinguishing between the two. The natural sciences are concerned with phenomena where we do not expect subjective factors to influence what happens, while the social sciences are concerned with phenomena where subjective factors may affect the outcome. In this book, we are concerned with the social sciences thus defined, and particularly with the effort to apply a scientific method of observation, formulation of hypotheses, and testing to such phenomena. The enormous size of this field has made it advisable to curtail our attention to the process of social change, especially in civilizations.
Hello and welcome to Amagi, hosted by myself, Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas both ancient and modern in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is episode 10, The Evolution of Civilizations. Hi Dylan, how's it going?
Hi Nima, I'm doing great. I am pretty excited to be switching gears here and talking a little bit about some history, which I hated so much in school.
Oh, same here, man.
Tell me why you hated history in school.
Because it was all about, and in 1808, this and that happened. And then in 1811, that happened. And if you got one date wrong, then you got your test mark down. And it was all about dates and dates and dates. And no actual connecting the dots, no discussion of ideas that led to big events, but just plainly rattling down dates and events. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just one damn fact after another, right?
Right. And no causes, no explanations. And what's the biggest driver of historical change, in your opinion, actually?
Well, before I read The Evolution of Civilizations or after I read The Evolution of Civilizations?
Yeah, before and after.
Before, I kind of had a pretty lefty, solipsistic viewpoint that none of it mattered because none of it made sense because it was all a bunch of names and dates that couldn't be connected.
Yeah.
So, I definitely did not have a good answer beforehand. But after, and we will be getting into this in detail, is the fact that instruments of social change will always have a tendency to become institutions, which are governed by vested interests. Now, I know I haven't defined any of that per this conversation, but as we heard in the intro, this is what fascinated me when I read this book. So, this episode and the next few episodes, we're obviously going to be going into a different gear than we have in our original episodes, which were mainly about MMT, modern money theory, and economics. We're going to be going into, how looking at this historical change and the evolution of civilizations. And before I read this book, Carol Quigley's The Evolution of Civilizations, I did actually start getting into history after I graduated from college, because I started bumping into resources. I think particularly when I started listening to Peace Revolution podcast, I started bumping into resources that had a different view of history than what you just described, which is just, one damn fact and date after another. And if you wrote July 27th on your test instead of July 28th, you just got -1 because that was the important part of the historical lesson. When I read this book, The Evolution on Civilizations, I was so blown away that I couldn't believe that I had ever read any other history book before I read this one. And if we look at what I was reading from it for the intro of this episode, this idea that the scientific method can be applied to social sciences. Now, on the face of it, my reaction to this, and I think your reaction to this, you're mentioning to me earlier, was, well, duh. Of course it should be applied to the social sciences. Why would that not be the case? And I guess the answer to that is kind of, well, duh in the other direction, where it's almost a rejection of the scientific method, in the sense that the assumptions are made that the situation is too complicated, and because social sciences are based off of human choices, there's simply no way to get the two to connect. And what Carroll Quigley does is he does get these to connect, and he essentially says, look, yes, the social sciences are more complicated because we have to deal with the fact that people's choices now affect what the outcomes are going to be, but more complicated doesn't necessarily mean impossible. And he brought up an interesting point that I don't think I read this in the intro, is that part of the assumption that the social sciences are too complicated is you just have too many millions of random people all making individual decisions, and it doesn't make sense to group them all and start trying to measure what they're all going to be doing, because there's no way to add up these individual decisions. Well, that's exactly what they do in social science. For example, I don't know if you knew this, or how many people listening would know this, that temperature is a attribute, a metric, which is actually based off of an aggregate averaging. Like, it doesn't make sense to talk about the temperature of a single atom or a single molecule.
Right.
Because the way you determine temperature is about how lots of molecules are bouncing around with each other and what any given molecule may be doing, randomly doing at any given moment.
It's a bell curve, essentially, right?
Yeah, it's a bell curve, essentially. And the same thing with, there's this joke between physics and chemistry where physics is the study of one atom and chemistry is the study of two. Yeah. Where in this super idealistic state, we kind of have this idea that natural science is represented by physics, where you're just kind of looking at what exactly is this one thing doing, and we're going to study that. When in reality, most science is dealing with lots of stuff together, and there's so much stuff together all at the same time that you can't simply add up all the individual components and say, okay, they're all doing this. You have to use mathematics that says, okay, all these individual components may or may not be doing X, Y, or Z randomly at any given moment, and if we add all that up, it averages out to this, and we're just going to use that, because otherwise the math is impossible. Well, that's the fact, them doing that, the natural sciences doing that, is the thing that the social sciences are saying, well, we can't figure this out because that's impossible, that you can't add all this up. And if we look at the natural sciences, well, the natural sciences are doing it, and there's no way that we shouldn't be able to turn around and look at the social sciences when doing this.
It's almost a little bit of vanity or overestimation on the part of humans when they say that, well, we are so complex and sophisticated, we can't possibly be subject to the scientific method. Yet when it comes to natural sciences, they tend to underestimate the randomness and complexity of matter and atoms and events, etc. I think
that's a really good point.
We've all been trained from early on to just believe that everything we're told right now about physics and climate and chemistry is established science, and it's a body of knowledge that we just need to apply. When science is not a body of knowledge, science is a process that never ends. But
as we've been Quigley points out at the beginning of this book, exactly.
Right. We've been taught to worship the natural sciences as if they were almost like a dogmatic religion, right?
Correct.
And at the same time, we've been trained to to not do that when it comes to human sciences, and think of ourselves as overly complicated and complex and unpredictable. When just as when you were just talking, that was exactly what was coming to my mind. We are actually, most of us at least, are not really that unpredictable and complex. Most of society is constantly molded by opinion manipulators who have been doing this for thousands and thousands and thousands and probably tens of thousands of years. Alan Watts says that we are the most studied species in the universe, us humans.
That's actually a good point. Well, and on top of that, to even back up what you're saying further, these people who feed us the propaganda, they also control the early childhood education. So not only are they the ones giving us the software, they're the kind of the ones that created the hardware that they give us the software for later.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about, and also when I say let's talk about, we're kind of going through Quigley's book as this episode is going to unfold.
Who's this Quigley guy?
That's a really good point. Carroll Quigley came onto everybody's radar during the inauguration of our favorite president, Bill Clinton, who the only name that he dropped during that inauguration was his mentor, Carroll Quigley, who he thanked. And Carroll Quigley was a professor of history at, I think it was Georgetown University. Yep. And these books that he wrote, he's most famous for writing the book Tragedy and Hope, which every conspiracy theorist worth his salt starts there for his information, because it's an awesome book to go to. But what I found with most people who have read or referenced Tragedy and Hope is they really focus on the conspiratorial nature of the information in the book, but they seem to miss the fact that Quigley is a brilliant historian, just by that alone. And he wrote another book called The Evolution of Civilizations, which he doesn't really get much credit for compared to Tragedy and Hope. Well, that I think is one of the most...
I just want to point out that, when people call us conspiracy theorists for referencing Carroll Quigley, we talk about the power of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and we're doing that by referencing the things that Carroll Quigley wrote. Carroll Quigley, who was their official historian. So we are actually, all we're doing is we're reading the things that he said, and that then these groups have been doing and continue to do throughout the world. So it's not really fair to call us conspiracy theorists, even though conspiracy theory by itself is not really a bad thing, but it's usually always used in a bad connotation.
In a derogatory sense. Yeah. And I was using it tongue in cheek.
No, I mean, we're trained.
That's a really good point to bring up.
We're trained to have a negative association with the word conspiracy theorist. Even I myself, even though I know that it's nonsense, it's hard to train that emotional reflex out of yourself, right? So
I agree.
All I'm saying is we're just reading from the guy who was the official historian for none other than the Council on Foreign Relations. So there might be, that might lend some credibility to his writings.
Yeah, and in addition to this conversation we had a second ago about the dynamics between the natural science and the social sciences, Carroll Quigley originally went to school for biochemistry. And like halfway through his college career, he switched over to history. And I think this puts him he's dead, puts him in a very unique position that he had the natural science training before moving over into the social sciences, and that's probably what really allowed him to make all these connections. So what we want to do is start to see if we can bring up principles that apply to history and the evolution of history, and I guess more specifically the evolution of culture, that apply in a very similar way that say, Newton's laws of motion apply to physics. And in order to do this, and again, I've written notes after reading the chapter on the book, and I'm going through the explanations that Quigley has given. Is Quigley first and foremost points out that reality is irrational, and humans grasp it rationally. Now, what exactly does that mean? For example, when we look at a rainbow is on a continuum, which is to say, most of us have learned to break down the rainbow into either 6 or 7 colors. Roy G. Biv. Sometimes indigo gets thrown in there for whatever reason between blue and violet. But in reality, there's an infinite number of colors in the rainbow. And the fact that we have chosen to draw some lines in the rainbow is something arbitrary that we've done. Now, that's not to say that drawing the lines was bad, or we shouldn't have drawn the lines, or that we should have drawn there somewhere else. But the first and foremost thing we should acknowledge is that the lines that we've drawn, reality doesn't really care whether we drew those or not. That they exist the way that they exist, and our drawing of lines is a man-made tool, and we need to recognize and remember the fact that it is a man-made tool. And as an example, where people have forgotten this in the past, Quigley actually brought up the ancient Greeks and the Pythagorean cults, or the cult, I guess there was one of them, where the Pythagoras said that, well, I guess back in the day, in classical civilization, there was an argument over whether the universe could be understood through the senses, or the universe could only be understood through pure reason. And the argument from Pythagoras was, because the senses are, what's the word I want? Inaccurate. They can fool you. Right? We can come up with contradictory evidence, or contradictory feelings from our senses about reality. Therefore, the only way to actually understand reality is through pure reason. And this is why he was obsessed with geometry, because geometry is like this.
And he communicated
the system where you can.
He communicated that through telepathy, I assume.
Exactly. I'm getting to the criticism. Let me explain it first.
Okay.
So this is why he was obsessed with geometry, and why we have the Pythagorean theorem. Even though I think Quigley pointed out that Pythagoras didn't come up with it. It's just that he was so obsessed with it. We named it after him.
Pythagoras himself went to Egypt and was schooled in the mysteries. So a lot of these.
Didn't he go to India too?
Probably, yeah.
Wasn't he all over the place?
India, Egypt, these are all places where a lot of these... Plato, same thing. Plato went to Egypt. A lot of people were educated in Egypt and trained and schooled in the ancient mysteries.
In these ancient mysteries, where they're obsessed with geometry, again, I guess not for example, specifically obsessed with geometry, because with geometry you can make these perfect theorems that fit beautifully with each other and are true by definition. Right? And then they said, okay, we need to... the sacred geometry of time?
Yeah, it's a quote from Sting. But he probably got it from somewhere else.
Okay. I haven't actually listened to Sting at all. So,
well, shame on you.
Bullshit. So, however, However, even one of Pythagoras' students, I guess his name was, I wrote it down here somewhere, Hippasus of Metapontium, pointed out to Pythagoras that even geometry is not rational. Because if you look at the square, and if you look specifically at the Pythagorean theorem, where if you have, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, what that means is the diagonal of a square, if each side of the square is one unit, is the square root of 2. Now, the square root of 2 is an irrational number. And what we typically think is an irrational number is a decimal that goes on forever and never repeats itself. But a more simple way to look at it is to say that, okay, there's no relationship between two numbers that exactly describes the square root of 2. And so his argument back to Pythagoras was like, look, this isn't rational. And remember, rational means ratio. You cannot make a ratio out of this. And so, like the joke that you were making about what did they communicate through telepathy, what this rationalist thinking does is it divorces you from reality, where there's never anything that you do to check to make sure that you're right. Because you're only right, you're right just because you're in your head. And Quigley argues that this is the reason that science was destroyed back in ancient Greece, that it never developed very far, is because this rationalist thinking that was essentially projected by Pythagoras was the one that took hold, as opposed to Hippasus, who obviously he wrote something down that stuck long enough. Fuck. He obviously wrote something down that stuck around long enough for us to read it, but he must not have been the popular opinion because, like you said, Plato picked up on the rationalist stuff, Socrates picked up on the rationalist stuff, and apparently Aristotle picked it up even though he rejected it later. So, another example, and this is also a fun historical fact, that did you know that the reason that we have 24 hours in a day is because the Neolithic garden cultures that preceded civilizations had a 12-unit counting system.
No, I didn't know that.
We're still using 12 hours in a day, and we still talk about a dozen eggs, and other things having to do with 12 because of
civilizations. What do you mean by that?
Can you hold that thought, and we'll get to it later? It might not even be in this episode, but
okay,
that will be gone over in detail.
Not a problem. Excellent.
So the question naturally is, someone who's looking at the title of this episode having to do with history, and now we're talking about irrational numbers and rainbows and shit, is going, what does this have to do with history? Well, so everything, I won't say everything because there's quantum mechanics, but a lot of the universe is on these continua, continua being the plural of continuum, where reality is irrational, and our ability to rationalize it is kind of this man-made tool or man-made map that we put on top of things to try to understand it. But it's super duper 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 important to recognize that this is simply a tool and it's not the reality itself. And if at any time that we find evidence that contradicts our reason or our ratio that we've put on top of reality, this is a scientific method, we have to either change our tool or change our map so it now fits the new contradiction, or we need to scrap it altogether, understanding that we were working with essentially erroneous science. So Quigley argues that all societies have their peculiarities with their culture, which he calls the dimension of abstraction. I found it very strange that he wrote this. He said, all societies exist in 5 dimensions. There's the 3 spatial dimensions, and then there's the fourth dimension of time, and then there's the fifth dimension of abstraction. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? That's a really weird thing to say.
Does it have anything to do with the spheres of power influence in society? I think he also lists 5, where he says military, political, cultural.
That's exactly what we're going to do. Yes. So Nima's been reading Tragedy and Hope, but he hasn't actually read The Evolution of Civilizations yet. So Quigley talks a lot about the topics found in The Evolution of Civilizations in Tragedy and Hope. So he's
especially in the beginning,
finding out he already knows this stuff. So in terms of the dimension of abstraction, Quigley says that the dimension of abstraction is also on a continuum, where there's an infinite number of facts that we can infinitely divide down into smaller and smaller and smaller categories, or bigger and bigger and bigger categories. And depending on what we're studying or what we want to talk about, one division may be more useful than another. But for him, he argues that there's 6 specific divisions that, at least in terms of looking at these, at this really zoomed out, how is a civilization working? There's 6 different categories, and that's military, political, social, economic, religious, and intellectual. So the military being the most concrete of this spectrum, and the intellectual being the most abstract of this spectrum. And each of these is essentially broken down into how the needs of the society are serviced. So essentially we could say that the military abstraction, or the military category, serves the need for group security. The political category serves the need to organize interpersonal power relationships. Social serves the need for companionship. Economic serves the need for material wealth. The religious category serves the need for psychological certainty. And the intellectual category serves the need for understanding. Now, again, to reemphasize, we could break these down further into smaller and smaller groups, similar to the way we could break down the rainbow into more and more specific colors. But for the sake of what we're talking about, we're going to be talking... these are pretty damn good ways to break down the way we view societies and the way we view civilizations. So, any change on any particular level, one of these 6 levels, we're going to refer to as historical development. And this is where we get into answering the question that you asked me at the beginning, which is, what is the most important thing to look at when we're looking at, to look for what's guiding historical development? And I said instruments and institutions, and essentially the question is, well, what does that mean? So the needs of these 6 levels in the spectrum are achieved by what Quigley calls instruments. The society creates an instrument to achieve a certain purpose. For example, to achieve the military purpose, which is the need for security, a society, for example, could create an army. Now, every instrument has the tendency to become an institution. This is where the instrument takes on a life of its own, distinct from its original purpose, and achieves the original purpose with decreasing effectiveness. And the main historical rule, again, according to Quigley, and I mean, I agree with it, is that all social instruments will tend to become institutions. So I already gave the example of the army. So let's say, we're getting invaded, and we say, okay, oh my God, we got to put some military together to defend ourselves. So we really quick scrap together a military, get some weapons, pick a general, go out, and we fight, and we win. We fight off the invaders, and now we have this military here, and we go, well, we better keep these guys around because we might get invaded again. So the military stays around, and at some point, the original purpose of defending us from invaders starts to turn more into doing regiments and paying the troops and holding all the pomp and circumstance for the high-level officers and impressing the politicians so everyone can still keep getting paid. And at some point, the military or the army gets, I guess, essentially bureaucratized, and it bogs down. And by the time the invaders do come back, suddenly it's like, oh yeah, I guess we're supposed to be defending this place, right? I was spending my entire day trying to figure out how to, get a pension once I retire, and how to retire as soon as I can. But yeah, I guess we'll figure out how to defend ourselves now. And when this happens, as this happens, whatever the original purpose was, in this case, defending the society, decreases in effectiveness. Now, Quigley gives three main reasons why this is the case. The first is, and I'm going through my notes here. So, in the example of the army, people in the army start serving their own purpose and fulfilling their own duties. So it's not anyone's individual job to achieve the purpose of the organization. Right? What one individual within this organization can't defend us from invaders. The second one is that everyone in the organization is naturally human, and therefore they have human egos, and thus they want to advance their personal position within the organization. The third is that because social conditions change, and they always do, and the members of the organization resist the change needed for this organization to adapt, because, they've got their own reasons for, wanting their position, they've become vested interests. So this term will come up again. I mean, we're all familiar with the term vested interest, but this is the natural progression of why these instruments become institutions. So, focusing on military, because I think military we'll see is a very, very good example of this. Here's a few examples that Quigley gives throughout history. So the first one is that Rome fell to Germanic invaders. Primarily, maybe not primarily, but a main cause was the Romans couldn't organize themselves to defend against charging horsemen.
First refugee crisis, by the way.
Oh yeah, right. Because the what was it? The Huns were pushing the Germans that were pushing them into Rome.
They were fleeing from the Huns, or the Huns were fleeing. I don't know. Somebody was fleeing someone.
I think it was the Huns. Huns. We could be wrong on that one, but I think it was the Huns. So, second one, medieval knights on horseback became the reigning force of medieval Europe. And so these guys were so effective. Actually, let me rewind that. So the Romans couldn't defend knights against charging men on horseback. The Germans destroy Rome, and this, the Dark Ages come around, where we start seeing knights on horseback as the most effective military weapon available. And this is such an effective military weapon that they were able to fight off Muslim invasions. They were able to fight off the barbarians, of North and Eastern Europe, and they were able to successfully pull off several crusades. The feudalistic knight on horseback was so effective. However, I believe it was around the 12th century, maybe in the 13th, that bowmen and pikemen specifically began to be integrated into armies. And Quigley gives this interesting example that the English at some point incorporated the bowmen into their ranks of the army, and they fought the French, and the French lost a battle miserably, and they just threw it off as a fluke because they couldn't get over the fact that men of low birth could kill men of noble birth from a distance.
And where did the Brits get that knowledge?
And this is an example of having a vested interest. What's that?
Where did the Brits suddenly get that knowledge?
Oh, they got attacked.
Okay.
By Bowman. Don't ask me where they originally came from. But they got attacked by Bowman, and they recognized, they said, oh, there's a new military force here that's really useful. We should take that into account.
After the Brits, after the Norman invasions of England? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. We're like 12th century.
Yeah,
here.
So then it was. So it was definitely after Norman invasions. Like the last true British king was, I think, 1016 or 1060 or something like that. And after that, it was all
1066. Was that the magic number?
I don't know. But after that, it was all just foreigners. To this day, actually, to the House of Windsor, it's not a British family. They're German.
It's,
Sachse,
German.
Coburg, and Gotha. Anyway, go on.
Thank you, Nima. Swiss pikemen were also an example of this. So, despite the fact that bowmen and pikemen suddenly became this effective fighting force that could fight off the mounted knight on horseback, and specifically, you can give pikes and bows to peasants, which don't require 8 hours of training and a manor with 100 serfs serving you. So, however, chivalry didn't just suddenly change or go away, because you had all these people with titles and nobility and land and pomp and circumstance and blah, 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 that they weren't interested in letting it go. So, the next example, and I think this is the most damning one, the most ridiculous damning one, and it has to do with World War I, because if we're going to get into ridiculous, World War I is always like where you want to go. The decline of cavalry. So, according to Quigley, cavalry should have been outdated by Waterloo, by the time Napoleon was around. That charging horsemen, just as Roman legionaries can't defend themselves against charging horsemen can't defend themselves against gunfire.
Or how about poison gas?
Well, not that either.
Didn't they use it in World War I?
Yeah, I did say in World War I. However, even before let me get to World War I. It's Quigley argues someone who is paying attention to military strategy should have seen it at Waterloo. They should have seen it in the Napoleonic battles that horses were already on their way out. And in the Crimean War, they saw this. In the Civil War, they really saw this, because during the Civil War, they'd already upgraded from muskets to high-powered rifles, even though they still had a muzzle loading and they slowed down. Cavalry just got shredded. So by the time we got to World War I, and there's goddamn machine guns, there's nothing a horse could do. Now, despite the fact that there was literally 100 years of evidence to anybody who just like stumbled into the military section of a library, the military history section of a library, showing that charging horses die really fast onto the onslaught of gunfire, particularly machine gun fire. During World War I, one of the biggest issues on all sides was supplying horses. So, one of the specific ones, I got the name in here somewhere. Maybe I didn't. I just wrote an American cavalry general. So there was an American cavalry general during World War I who apparently was fighting Washington, D.C. just as vigorously as he was fighting on the front, because he felt that the ships delivering supplies should be delivering horses and horse fodder, whereas the guy he was arguing with back in Washington, D.C. felt that they should be delivering men and munitions. And the British were, I think, quickly pointed out that 25% of shipping from Britain was horse feed. And that he even argues that one of the reasons for the Russian collapse was the fact that Russia couldn't figure out how to organize the transportation for horse feed. So, I mean, it's so bizarre to me that an institution, for example, the cavalry, is so dedicated to making sure that the cavalry is the most important part of the military that by the time we get to World War I, they're literally sacrificing millions of lives. Like, millions of people are dying per battle in World War I. And they just keep, no, we need more horses. We need more horse feed. We just got to wait to break open, and then we'll send the horses in. Yeah, just throw more on the pile, man. And furthermore, in World War I, bayonets. So, like horses, bayonets were equally useless on the battlefield of modern guns. I guess that, when you're muzzle loading and, you got your one shot, then you got to charge, it's a kind of a different story from, having machine guns and, shells where you can just load the gun and fire it as opposed to muzzle loading it. Quickly wrote that even in 1918, this is the end of, the last year of World War I, or was it 1919? Anyway, it's near the end of World War I. A major part of American training was devoted to bayonet practice. And he wrote, still true in 1940. Even though the stats from World War I were available, showing that the casualties from bayonet wounds were literally microscopic. And he makes a funny comment, which is essentially, there's bayonet drill instructors that probably don't know how to do anything else, that need to make sure that they have something to do, so they're going to sit there and argue and come up with, reasons why understanding how to fight with a bayonet is super important. And thus, Quigley concludes with a quote from some French premier once upon a time. War is far too important to ever be entrusted to soldiers. Now, we've been talking about military examples here until now, and as I said, I think they're the best examples to start with because it really shows that how an institution, again, the cavalry being the best example here, won't change even in the face of millions of deaths. We will continuously throw people into a meat grinder for 4+ years rather than change our organization. What, to grind everybody into a pulp?
To cull the population.
The population. Well, I could see if that was a goal for the higher-ups, but for example, this American cavalry general... Well, and I mean, I remember any World War I history book I read that there's always this weird thing about the horses, that everybody was just like waiting for the cavalry charge. Like, anytime now, it's going to break open, we're going to get that cavalry charge, and we're going to win the war. And they just didn't learn. And it's... Again, World War I is this crazy example where so many people died because we suddenly had the industrialization of warfare. But this isn't peculiar to World War I, and it's not peculiar. I can't say that word. Peculiar. It's not specific. It's not specific to World War I, and it's not specific to military. Shut up, Nima. I can talk. Essentially, this comment about how war is too important to ever be entrusted to soldiers can pretty much be broadened to include all professional experts. Every organization becomes a vested interest institution concerned with the efforts to maintain itself as opposed to achieving its purpose. Thus, and this is his list, Greeks defeated the Persians. The Roman navy defeated the Carthaginian fleet. The English defeated the French chivalry in the 100 Years' War. The English navy, which was barely 75 years old, defeated the Spanish Armada. The colonists won the American Revolution. New French armies defeated the old Prussian armies during the Napoleonic Wars. The Boers held off the English for years, and the Japanese beat the Russians in 1905. Example after example after example. So, for some non-military examples, workers' unions. So, workers' unions are originally designed to essentially free you from the slavery of the management. But I think a good question for anybody who's been in a union or seen how they work, you start to wonder if you haven't become a slave to the union itself. The Republican Party of 1854 was established to protect freedom and prevent the extension of slavery, and by 1868 it was an organized machine of vested interests with a fully functioning spoils system. I don't know how much you know about the history of carpetbagging in the South, but that's a horrifying one to go read about. The small amount that I know is essentially this is the official story, that after the Civil War in the southern United States, and slavery was abolished, the South was coming up with all sorts of different weird laws to essentially recreate slavery with different words. So the North sent down the military to essentially declare martial law, and there was this power vacuum where any would-be mini conqueror with a carpet bag, that was a joke because they often showed up with bags made out of carpets, could come and basically become a governor and extract the local area dry. Another example, churches are created to bring psychological security to men by connecting them with deity. However, they can quickly become an institution with huge wealth and power, with its primary concern being to expand that wealth and power. And our favorite, a fourth example, college. So the purpose of college was to train youth, and at some point, it begins to lower its standards in order to increase admissions, and professors start to fight with each other, and they want to lower these admissions because the more students that they can attract means they can acquire a bigger pie of a bigger slice of the pie of the university budget. Which I'll be goddamned if that's not the state of university today. In Quigley's time, you didn't even go into debt $100,000 to go to university. And the fifth example, I really like this one, is the example of football, meaning soccer in this case, that football, according to the story here, I don't know how accurate this is, but it still shows this institutionalization of instruments very clearly. So originally football was taken on by English universities to get students exercise who needed it. And so these students would exercise, and naturally they would be competitive, and they would start making games. And because the games were competitive, they would start setting up games that people could watch, and they would have big games throughout the year. And because there's kind of this need for revenge if you lose, people start taking these a little bit seriously. So you start inviting the captains of the winning team from the previous year to come teach your previous team, and now you've got a coach. And at some point, the the winners are the ones that are able to hire full-time coaches, but in order to hire full-time coaches, you got to start charging for seating. But if you start charging for seating guarantees that you have a seat. So now you got to build a stadium. Well, now you really got to charge for seating, and now you got to hire a full-time coach, and now you got to start looking for players, because if you're scouting for players, because if your players aren't any good, you're not going to attract very many people for seating, and you're not going to sell many seats. And at some point, this thing goes and goes and goes until you have these massive stadiums that are so big they're not even on campus, and that the football players who are playing for them rarely interact with the students in college, and so the students in college who need the exercise the most sit and watch the students who need the exercise the least play football. And the entire time this is happening, nobody thinks to sit back and say, well, what's the purpose of football anyway? Because the purpose has been lost. The instrument has become
people generally don't ask
institutionalized.
themselves that question about anything, I think.
And I think this is why this historical rule is true.
I want to add, how about charitable organizations? How about like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller, Carnegie, NGOs, the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, all these supposed charitable organizations.
Man, did you have that list ready?
with giant office buildings, boardrooms, full-time staff, pensions, and all these things, but you know they're really taking care of the world for you.
Yeah, and they're really taking care of the environment too. I want to continue this conversation. On this. I want to explore personal experiences with this, because I think this explanation really strikes a chord with everybody, because everybody can see it everywhere immediately when you hear it. You're like, oh yeah, that's why the government sucks. Oh yeah, that's why the school system sucks. Oh yeah, that's why my church is awful. Oh yeah, that's why, this anything that you can think of is even old businesses. And quickly says that the institutionalization of instruments is found in almost all social phenomenon, and it is the most widespread historical phenomenon that we can identify. This is the Newton's law of motion equivalent to the social sciences, this institutionalization of instruments. And I wanted to bring up again, I brought this up, it wasn't on this show, it was on another one on the Think Liberty Network, Dune by Frank Herbert. I think Frank Herbert was reading Carroll Quigley. So Frank Herbert died in 1986. Carroll Quigley, I think, died in the early 70s, and he wrote these books in the mid 60s. Because if you read Frank Herbert's books, particularly the last two Dune books and another one of his books called The Dosadi Experiment, the Ben Gesserit from Dune, which is this essentially an organization, their entire society is built around the fact that they recognize this problem. That eventually, any organization that we make is going to start to serve itself. So we have to head it off at the pass and make sure that we're constantly reinventing our organizations and constantly changing them so they don't institutionalize. And in the Dosadi Experiment, and of course this is all sci-fi, I love the fact that he creates this in a sci-fi universe, because it always gave him the excuse for people not to take it so seriously, because he could always be like, oh, it's just sci-fi, dude. Bullshit, it's sociology. In the Dosadi Experiment, there's even the main character works for the Bureau of Sabotage, where its primary goal is to sabotage government and slow it down, because government will naturally institutionalize and turn itself into a self-feeding organization. and there was some part in the history of this, this universe that he created, that where everyone recognized that governments have a tendency to do this, so we need to make an organization called the Bureau of Sabotage that has the authority to sabotage governments legally.
It's like
it's
a QA
totally
department
bizarre.
in any software business. Makes total sense to me.
It is a QA
quality
department.
assurance.
I've never worked in a software business.
Well, if you build software, or I guess anything, any engineering, you want to make sure that it doesn't break and that it works. So you hire people who try to break it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see.
And
yes.
those are QA engineers.
Yeah. It totally makes sense to me, too. And to bring this out of the realm of science fiction, I've been listening to Dan Pena. Have you heard of him, Nima?
The billionaire?
Yeah, the $50 billion
I believe
man
one of
who
his
who
books
trains.
has the humble title, Your First $100 Million.
Yes, that guy. So I've been listening to him a lot recently, and I've read through one of his books, and one of the things he mentioned is when he forms a company, or when he forms a dream team that buys a business, because that's essentially what he's doing, is he buys businesses for a discount, or he teaches you how to buy a business for a discount and then sell it, and like for transactions of, millions and billions of dollars. That when he designs his organization, he says, my structure always follows my strategy. It's strategy first, structure second. And he said the reason that other businesses eventually get shitty is because they put structure first and strategy second. Well, the structure and strategy is just different words for institution and instrument.
Well, yeah, it's
right?
Also structure is organization. Organization grants positions of prestige and authority to people. So I guess that's why people always gravitate towards that. Let's assign roles and prestige first, and then deal with what we actually want to do.
Right. And then, as Dan Pena points out in his book, that if you have that sort of situation, if you want to get something done, well, everyone's more concerned about their position and their prestige before getting the thing done. And he said, well, if you actually want to get something done, everyone's prestige and title and all that other bullshit gets to change at any given moment, depending on what the organization needs to do. And if he's the fucking $50 billion man and he trains other people to be $50 billion men, I think there's something to that. Was there any other examples that came to your mind of institutions?
Well,
while you're thinking of it, I met with a friend this weekend, and we got on the subject of health inspectors. And he said he used to work for a tea shop. And he was working one day, and he turned around and noticed there was this guy behind the counter, just like poking around and looking at stuff. And he's like, "Can I help you?" And he said the guy didn't even look up at him, and just kind of sort of half-assed showed his badge. He said, "Seattle Health Inspector. Hey, you need to clean that pile. Hey, you need to wash that. Hey, you can't put that there." And he said he felt like the sheriff in an old Western just walked in, just like, "I own this joint." And he said, "I don't really know what this had to do with protecting the health of the people of the community," right? It was like he just wanted to come in and boss everyone around.
I have an idea that the medical establishment is no longer about healing us or taking care of us, but it's killing us and making us unhealthy.
Yeah,
just so they can
making us unhealthy.
Just so they continue being in demand, basically.
Yeah, they can continue selling drugs, and doctors continue to have high prestige and high high amounts of money. The university system can keep making people take 8 years of college in order to become doctors and blah da 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 da. And then whether or not you actually get any better is,
I mean, science. Like
ancillary.
Global warming hysteria has become an institution by itself that commands I don't know how many billions and billions of dollars every year, and people make statues of polar bears and write big reports, and it's all it's all bullshit. But it's become an institution. It's become a dogmatic religion, in a sense.
Well, you've heard the most recent climate doomsday report, right? That if we don't buy $50 billion worth of Al Gore's books, that the temperature is going to rise 10 degrees by next year.
Yeah. I mean, it's now, the new year is now 2040. It's all over in 2040, okay?
Well, does Jesus come back at the same time? Can we have that prediction at the same time, too?
Well, he's definitely not going to be...
And then we can have Jesus doesn't return and the world doesn't end at the same time.
Jesus definitely won't stay at a beach condo in Miami if Al Gore gets his way.
Oh yeah, it was Dan Pena who proved global warming. We're getting off topic here. Dan Pena proves global warming is bullshit because a bank will give you a loan on a condo, which is theoretically under the water line that's supposed to come up due to the ice caps melting.
They would legally have to put that in the prospectus if there was any credible science. They would all have to put it in the prospectus, and not one bank would lend. And he was like, there's not one prospectus with any such warnings, and there's not one bank who refused to loan because of global warming.
Sorry.
In fact, he was like, not one MFer. Not one MF.
Yeah, he's swearalicious. Okay, so as instruments become more institutionalized, they become less effective at achieving their goal, as we just discussed. As this happens, more people become discontented, and typically people will put up with a lot of discontent without doing anything, but there's a certain level of discontent that gets reached.
So is this where this trend towards institutionalization, does that occur uniformly across or close to uniformly across all these 6 strata of society? Okay.
Yes. I'll repeat this part. The institutionalization of instruments is found in almost all social phenomena. It is the most widespread historical phenomenon.
But is it possible that it develops faster in one field and slower in another? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, and I'm sure it develops faster in one culture than another. And I think we'll be talking more about that on the next episode. But how different cultures deal with the institutionalization of instruments, because there's a response to this. So I was talking about how people can get will eventually become discontented with their institutions, as we were just talking about several, the environmental institution being one of them, the health department being another. We need a Bureau of Sabotage. That would be great. People will begin to try to reform these institutions. And quickly says that this creates a tension between the vested interests of the institutions and the reformers, and this strain between the two groups he's calling the tension of development. And this tension between these two groups is what powers historical development. This is deep. that this thing that I mean, you get annoyed just talking about it because you can think of so many examples of so many organizations that are so ineffective at what they're doing, that our frustration with those organizations, once enough people reach a certain level of frustration that they're going to do something about it, that tension is what's potentially going to lead us down into something else. So there's 3 different things that can happen once that level of discontent is reached. So the first one Quigley calls reform. This is where an institution becomes completely reformed, that relatively speaking, it begins to achieve its purpose and becomes an instrument again. The second option is circumvention, where the institution is left with its vested interests and privileges, and a new instrument is created that does the job of the old one. And so, for example, the King of England is still around, the Emperor of Japan is still around, but the Parliament and the Prime Minister are doing everything. Even though with the English royalty, I guess there's a prerogative where they could just end Parliament whenever they feel like it, but that's a different story.
And they've done it.
Yeah. Apparently there's a Lord Warden of Cinque Ports, who was apparently the person who was in charge of the English Navy. He no longer guards the ports of England. The Royal Navy does. Even though he's still around, and I'm sure he's got a big suit and a crazy mustache and shows up to all the noble events and gets a lot of money for doing nothing. Feudalism defended Europe against the Saracens and barbarian invaders for hundreds of years, but became a verified institution of hereditary privileges. This was circumvented by a royal army, but all the nobility still exists. There's still lords and ladies and sirs and barons and earls and counts and dukes and all this crap that the American societies were more enlightened to throw in the garbage. The third option is called reaction, where the vested interests triumph in the struggle, and the people of the society are stuck with the burden of the ineffective institution for an indefinite period. And so these 3 methods of institutionalization are going to be central to the discussion of the evolution of civilizations that we're going to be talking about in the next few episodes. So, Nima, I thought that this was a good stopping point.
That was
before we get into the meat and potatoes.
That was incredibly enlightening, and we will pick it up from here then, I guess, next time, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry.
Any last thoughts on that before we cut out?
Well, I'm guessing, we're gonna. So the understanding of how instruments turn into institutions, I think is fundamental. So just as a cliffhanger, I'm guessing what follows from that is we'll get into Quigley's expansion theory of civilizations, because he talks about different phases and how different civilizations have expanded over the years, and he identifies the same pattern that occurs over and over again. So, speaking of scientific method, he tests his hypotheses, and ultimately, I guess, if you have a lot of discontented people and a lot of vested interests in bloated institutions, then that could lead to the decay of a civilization. But we will get into that next time. Thank you so much, Dylan. This was fascinating stuff. This has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And we are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Get in touch with us, leave us comments, and we will see you next time.